I found the map on the last Tuesday of October in 1958, pressed between the pages of a psalter that had not been opened in what the condition of its spine suggested was at least 40 years, possibly longer, on the highest shelf of the archive room in the convent of St. Ursula in Saint-Domingue, where I had been assigned to catalog and restore the library collection that had survived the German occupation in various states of damage and disorder. I was 51 years old, and I had been a nun for 26 years, and an archivist for 19 of those years. And I want to tell you immediately that my first response to finding that map was not excitement, and was not the kind of dramatic recognition that people imagine when they hear the word treasure. My first response was professional. I noted the document's physical characteristics, its approximate age based on paper quality and ink oxidation, its dimensions, its condition, its position within the host volume, and I placed it carefully on the examination table, and I photographed it with the camera that the Diocesan Archive Office had provided for exactly this kind of documentation. And then I sat down, and I read it. And the reading is where the professionalism began to encounter something it was not fully equipped to process. Because what I was reading was not a curiosity or an administrative artifact, or a fragment of institutional history. It was a set of directions, written in the Latin of the late 16th century, to something that someone in the late 16th century had considered worth hiding with sufficient care that they had encoded the directions in a document concealed inside a book of Psalms and left it in an archive room where it had waited for approximately 360 years for a 51-year-old archivist to find it. My name is Sister Euphrazina Bartoshevich, and I am going to tell you what I found and what I did with it, and what finding it cost me, and what it eventually gave back. And I am going to tell you all of it, honestly, including the parts where I made mistakes and the parts where the mistake turned out to be something other than a mistake. I had come to archival work through the particular path that leads people to it who were not trained for it formally, but were shaped for it by temperament and early experience. My father had been a bookbinder in Kielce, and I had grown up in the workshop, which means I had grown up with old books, with the smell of aged paper and leather, and the particular silence of rooms where old things are kept, and with an understanding of how physical objects encode the time they have traveled through in ways that reward careful examination. I entered the convent at 25 with this understanding already formed, and the sisters recognized it and applied it before I had fully understood that it was being applied, assigning me first to the care of the chapel's liturgical books, and then gradually to the broader library, and then to the archive work that became the center of my religious life for the following 26 years. I was not unhappy with this. The archive is a form of prayer that does not require the word form of prayer, a sustained act of attention toward things that are old and fragile, and contain within them the traces of lives and decisions and knowledge that would otherwise be lost entirely. And I brought to it the same quality of reverence I brought to the formal hours of prayer, because I experienced them as the same activity, conducted in different registers. The Psalter in which I found the map was a 16th century edition, printed in Krakow, with handwritten marginalia in 3 different hands, indicating that it had been used actively across at least 3 generations of readers before being shelved and forgotten. The map itself was folded into quarters and had been placed between pages 247 and 248, with the care of someone who intended it to remain there securely, rather than to be found accidentally. Which is to say, it had been placed in the fold of the binding, rather than simply laid between the pages, requiring someone to open the book completely flat to see it at all, which was something that the casual reader would not do, and which I had done only because I was examining the binding condition as part of my catalog assessment. The paper of the map was different from the paper of the Psalter, heavier and of higher quality, and the ink was a different formulation, darker and more resistant to the oxidation that had browned the Psalter's pages, suggesting that the map had been made with the specific intention of lasting, which tells you something about the person who made it and the seriousness with which they regarded what they were directing the reader toward. The Latin was not difficult for me. 26 years of religious life and 19 years of working with ecclesiastical documents had given me a Latin that was functional across the range of styles that several centuries of church documentation produced. And the Latin of the map was careful rather than elegant. The Latin of a practical man setting down precise information, rather than a scholar composing for an audience. It described a location in terms of its relationship to three landmarks: the eastern tower of the Benedictine Abbey at Sandomierz, a specific oak tree described as the largest in the abbey's eastern garden, and a stone marker bearing a cross that had been placed at the boundary of the abbey's property in the year of our Lord 1487. From these three landmarks, it provided distances and directions that were precise in the way of someone who had paced the distances themselves and was confident in their accuracy. And at the terminus of those directions, it described, in language that was suddenly more compressed than the careful specificity of the directions, a vault beneath the stone, sealed with iron, containing that which was entrusted to the care of God against the time of need. I sat with that phrase for a long time. That which was entrusted to the care of God against the time of need. It is the language of someone who is hiding something because a specific danger has arrived or is approaching, hiding it with the intention of recovery when the danger has passed, and who is uncertain whether they will survive to conduct that recovery, and is therefore entrusting the recovery to whoever finds the document. The late 16th century in the Sandomierz region of Poland was a period of specific and documented danger. The Swedish incursions, the Ottoman pressures from the south, the internal religious conflicts of the Reformation period producing disruptions in the monastic communities that had made the region's accumulated wealth vulnerable in ways that the preceding stable centuries had not prepared the institutions for. Someone, in that period of danger, had hidden something and had left directions to it in a psalter in the archive of a convent, and either they had not survived to retrieve it, or the psalter had been separated from whoever they had intended to find it, and it had sat in the archive room for 360 years, accumulating the particular patience of things that are waiting. I told no one immediately. I want to be honest about this decision, because it is the decision I have examined most carefully across the years since. The decision to spend 3 days studying the map and its implications before bringing it to anyone else's attention. I justified it to myself then, and I justify it to myself now with the same reasoning: that the correct first response to a document of uncertain significance and unknown provenance is study rather than announcement, because announcement before understanding produces the kind of excitement that interferes with the careful work that a document like this requires. The more honest additional reason, which I include because honesty about one's own motivations is a discipline that religious life is supposed to cultivate, and which I have tried to practice, is that for 3 days I wanted it to be mine, not to keep, not to exploit, but to understand privately before the understanding became shared and therefore changed by being shared, because understanding that is still private is understanding that is still pure. And I wanted 3 days of that purity before I gave it over to the process that it would inevitably need to enter. I brought the map to Mother Superior Benedicta on the fourth day, with my 3 days of notes and my transcription of the Latin and my preliminary assessment of the document's date and provenance and the historical context that made its existence explicable. Mother Superior Benedicta was 68 years old and had been running the convent of St. Ursula for 16 years, and she responded to what I showed her with the quality of attention that I had always respected in her, complete and without theater, reading everything I had prepared before saying anything. Then she asked me 3 questions. How confident was I in the Latin translation? Entirely confident, I told her. Had I determined whether the landmarks described in the document still existed? 2 of the 3 did, I told her. The eastern tower of the Benedictine Abbey was still standing, and the stone boundary marker, though I had not yet physically examined it, appeared in the Abbey's historical records as still present in its original location as of the most recent survey in 1931. The oak tree, described as the largest in the Abbey's eastern garden, had been cut down in 1887, according to the Abbey's chronicle, which I had checked in the diocesan archive, but its former position was documented in a diagram attached to that chronicle entry. The third question was what I thought we should do. I told her I thought we should go to the Abbey and walk the directions and see what the terminus of those directions produced. We went in November. Mother Superior Benedicta and I, and Father Kazimierz, who was the Abbey's current archivist, and who had been contacted through the diocesan office, with enough information to make his participation appropriate and not enough to make the visit chaotic, before we understood what we were visiting. Father Kazimierz was 70 years old and had been at the Benedictine Abbey for 43 of those years, and he knew the Eastern Garden with the intimacy of a man who had walked it across 4 decades of seasonal change. When I showed him the diagram of the oak tree's former position and the stone boundary marker, and explained the directions the map provided, he walked us to a specific location in the Eastern Garden without hesitation, a location approximately 15 meters from the Abbey's eastern wall, where the ground was level and undistinguished and covered with the autumn grass that covered everything else in the garden. He said that he had always known that section of ground sounded different underfoot than the surrounding area. He said he had mentioned it to the previous father archivist 20 years earlier and had been told it was probably a collapsed drainage channel from the medieval period. He said this with the expression of a man who is reassessing a piece of information he has held for 20 years in the wrong category. We did not excavate that day. The excavation required permissions that were numerous, and the institutions that needed to grant them were the Abbey's own administration, the diocesan office, the Civil Heritage Authority that had been established in Poland's post war reorganization to oversee the discovery and preservation of historically significant finds, and the municipal authority in Sandomierz. Assembling these permissions took 4 months, across which I continued my catalog work in the archive and tried to maintain the equanimity that the situation required, and largely succeeded, though Sister Agnieszka, who shared the archive room with me on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, told me later that I had been noticeably less present in conversation than usual during those 4 months, which I accept as accurate. The excavation was conducted in March 1959 by a team from the Jagiellonian University's Archaeology Department, under the supervision of the Civil Heritage Authority and in the presence of Father Kazimierz and Mother Superior Benedicta and myself. They reached the vault at a depth of 1 meter and 40 centimeters. The iron seal that the map's Latin had described was corroded into near dissolution, but retained enough structural integrity to confirm that something had been deliberately sealed there. And when the stone was lifted and the vault opened, the contents were consistent with what a 16th century monastic community would have considered worth protecting against time of need: liturgical items of gold and silver, the kind that a community in danger would remove from its chapel and conceal rather than allow to fall into hostile hands. A collection of manuscript documents in leather cases that had preserved them in remarkable condition, which the Jagiellonian University's medieval manuscript specialists subsequently assessed as including 3 texts of significant historical value that had not been known to exist outside fragmentary references in other documents, and a small sealed ceramic container that held coins, gold coins of the type minted in Krakow in the late 16th century, 43 of them, which the Heritage Authority's numismatic consultant valued at a figure I will not specify, but which placed the collection's monetary worth well beyond what anyone had anticipated when we stood in the Eastern Garden in November with the diagram of a cut-down oak tree and a map I had found in a psalter on a Tuesday in October. The collection was transferred to the National Heritage Authority in Warsaw and catalogued, and the manuscript documents were studied and published, and the liturgical items were returned, after considerable institutional negotiation, to the Benedictine Abbey from which they had been removed approximately 360 years earlier. I was present for the return ceremony in September 1959, and I stood in the Abbey chapel and watched Father Casimir receive a processional cross that had been hidden under the Eastern Garden since the late 16th century and was now back where it had been made to be. And I thought about the person who had hidden it, about the person who had been afraid enough to bury the things they loved and careful enough to leave directions, and realistic enough about their own survival to encode those directions in a document that could wait in a psalter for whoever came next. I did not know their name. I have never found their name in any record. But I have spent the years since finding the map carrying the understanding that they trusted someone to come, someone with the patience and the training and the quality of attention that the finding required, and that I was that someone, which is not a distinction I chose, but which I have spent the years since trying to deserve.